The crisp autumn breeze swept through Boston Logan International Airport as the Wilson family made their way through the gleaming terminal. Dr. Wilson, a renowned neurosurgeon with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, guided his family through the bustling crowd. His wife, Mrs. Wilson, a successful corporate attorney known for breaking glass ceilings in the legal world, walked beside him with the confident stride that had become her trademark in courtrooms across the country. Their two children, 14-year-old Michael and 12-year-old Ashley, trailed behind them, still chattering about their amazing weekend in Boston. The family had just wrapped up a much-needed vacation, touring historical sites and catching a Celtics game, a passion they all shared. They were dressed comfortably for the journey home to Atlanta, designer sneakers, premium jeans, and cozy sweaters that spoke of relaxed luxury rather than flashy wealth. As they walked through the airport's main concourse, Dr. Wilson checked his watch, a habit he'd developed from years of precise surgical scheduling. "We should head to the private terminal now," he said softly to his wife. "James just texted that the jet's ready for pre-flight checks." The family had recently acquired their own private aircraft, a decision made after Dr. Wilson's increasingly demanding schedule at his network of hospitals made commercial flights less practical. The children's eyes lit up at the mention of their private jet. Even after several trips, the excitement hadn't worn off. "Can I sit in the cockpit again during takeoff?" Michael asked eagerly, adjusting his backpack. His father smiled warmly, remembering how his own fascination with aviation had started at a similar age. Mrs. Wilson gently guided them toward the connecting corridor that led to the private aviation area. The hallway was quieter than the main terminal, its walls lined with photographs of historic aircraft and Boston's aviation milestones. Ashley paused briefly to admire a black and white image of Amelia Earhart, her latest role model since starting her school project on pioneering women in aviation. The family moved unhurriedly, enjoying these last moments of their weekend together before returning to their busy lives in Atlanta. Dr. Wilson carried their shared duffel bag, while Mrs. Wilson scrolled through her phone, already preparing for tomorrow's big case. The children walked ahead, playing their usual game of spotting different airline logos through the massive windows overlooking the runways. What they didn't notice was the middle-aged woman who had stopped her conversation mid-sentence to stare at them. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer handbag screamed first-class passenger, but the look in her eyes was anything but classy. She watched as the family approached the private terminal entrance, her expression morphing from curiosity to suspicion to outright indignation. The Wilsons were just about to scan their security passes when they heard it, that sharp, commanding voice that would turn their peaceful Sunday afternoon into something entirely unexpected. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her tone dripping with unwarranted authority. "I believe you're going the wrong way. The regular terminal is back that way." Little did she know, she was about to learn a valuable lesson about making assumptions, one that would soon make her wish she'd minded her own business on this sunny Boston afternoon. The woman's voice cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife through butter. Mrs. Peters, as her designer luggage tag prominently displayed, had already started walking towards the Wilson family, her heels clicking aggressively against the airport's polished floor. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed accusingly in their direction as she approached. "This is a restricted area," she announced loudly, drawing attention from nearby travelers. "The regular passenger terminal is that way." She gestured back toward the main concourse with an exaggerated sweep of her arm, as if explaining directions to small children. Dr. Wilson instinctively stepped slightly in front of his family, a supple protective movement born from years of experiencing similar situations. He kept his expression neutral, though his shoulders tensed slightly. His wife placed a gentle hand on Ashley's shoulder, noting how their daughter had shrunk slightly behind her brother. "Ma'am," Dr. Wilson began calmly, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when explaining complex procedures to nervous patients. "We appreciate your concern, but we're exactly where we need to be." But Mrs. Peters wasn't interested in listening. She pulled out her phone, holding it up as if it were a shield. "I've been flying private for 15 years, she declared, her volume increasing with each word. "I know everyone who uses this terminal, and I've never seen you before." Her eyes narrowed as she looked them up and down, lingering judgmentally on Michael's designer sneakers and Mrs. Wilson's casual travel outfit. Several other travelers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some pulled out their phones, sensing the situation was about to become social media worthy. A young man in a business suit looked uncomfortable, taking a half step forward as if wanting to intervene, but not quite finding the courage. "Mom," Michael whispered, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and hurt. "Why is she doing this?" Mrs. Wilson squeezed her son's shoulder reassuringly, but her eyes never left Mrs. Peters, who was now furiously typing something into her phone. "I'm calling security," Mrs. Peters announced triumphantly, as if she'd just declared checkmate in a chess game. "This is exactly why we have restricted areas. You can't just walk in here like you own the place." The irony of her statement would soon become apparent, but for now, she continued her tirade. "I'm sure you people think you're very clever, but we have protocols here. I'm on the airport's VIP passenger list, and I've never seen you at any of our events." Dr. Wilson maintained his composure, though a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He'd faced similar situations before, in hospital parking lots, at country clubs, even once at his own medical practice. His wife, a veteran of countless courtroom battles, recognized the familiar signs of prejudice masked as concern. Ashley, who had been quiet until now, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, our pilot is waiting," she said, loud enough for Mrs. Peters to hear, though the significance of her words seemed lost on the agitated woman. "Don't worry, sweetie," Mrs. Peters said condescendingly, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Security will help you find your way back to the right terminal. I'm sure there's a lovely commercial flight waiting for you somewhere." Little did she know, the security team she'd just summoned would indeed help sort things out, just not in the way she expected. Through the terminal's glass doors, they could already see 2 airport security officers approaching, their faces professional and alert. The next few minutes would teach Mrs. Peters a lesson about assumptions that she wouldn't soon forget, though the Wilsons had already decided in their shared glances that they would handle this situation with the same grace and dignity they'd demonstrated throughout their successful lives. The 2 security officers approached with measured steps, their faces professionally neutral as they assessed the situation. The taller officer, wearing a name badge that read Officer Rodriguez, spoke first. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes taking in both parties with practiced efficiency. Before anyone else could speak, Mrs. Peters jumped in, her voice trembling with what she clearly thought was righteous indignation. "Yes, officer. These people are trying to access the private terminal. I've never seen them here before, and I'm a regular. They're clearly in the wrong area." She waved her phone in the air, still recording everything. The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose semicircle around the scene. A young woman in a business suit whispered to her colleague, "This is so wrong." Several phones were raised, capturing the interaction. The incident was already making its way onto social media platforms, though nobody knew yet how viral it would become. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez addressed Mrs. Peters, "please lower your phone." He then turned to Dr. Wilson. "Sir, could you please explain your presence in this area?" Dr. Wilson reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, years of experience having taught him the importance of clear movements in tense situations. "Of course, officer. I have our documentation right here." His voice remained steady and calm, a stark contrast to Mrs. Peters' increasingly agitated state. Mrs. Peters couldn't contain herself. "Documentation? What documentation could they possibly have? I'm telling you, they don't belong here. I know all the regular private jet owners, and they're certainly not." "Ma'am," the second officer, whose badge read Officer Chen, interrupted firmly. "Please let us handle this." The authority in his voice finally made Mrs. Peters take a step back, though she still clutched her phone tightly. Meanwhile, young Michael had moved closer to his mother, his expression a mixture of anger and hurt. "Mom, why won't she just leave us alone?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Wilson wrapped an arm around his shoulders, her attorney's mind already cataloging every word and action of the incident. Ashley, who had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "Our pilot just texted again, Dad. He says the weather window for takeoff is getting shorter." She held up her phone, showing the message from their regular pilot. Mrs. Peters scoffed loudly. "Their pilot? Oh, please, this is ridiculous. They're obviously making this up. "Officer, I demand you escort them back to the main terminal immediately." Dr. Wilson had finally retrieved his wallet and was calmly pulling out several cards. The first was his pilot's license. He'd earned it 2 years ago, fulfilling a lifelong dream. Next came the aircraft registration papers, followed by his airport security clearance card. Each document he handed to Officer Rodriguez was another nail in the coffin of Mrs. Peters' assumptions. The crowd watched intently as Officer Rodriguez examined each document, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read. Officer Chen maintained his position between the two parties, though his posture had subtly shifted. He was now facing more toward Mrs. Peters than the Wilson family. "Everything appears to be in order here," Officer Rodriguez began, but Mrs. Peters wasn't having it. "What? No, that's impossible. Those must be fake. I demand to see." She took a step forward, but Officer Chen smoothly moved to block her path. "Ma'am," Officer Chen's voice carried a warning tone, "you need to step back now. You're interfering with our duties, and if you continue, we'll have to take appropriate action." The atmosphere in the terminal had become electric. Everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. Mrs. Peters' face had turned an interesting shade of red as she watched Officer Rodriguez hand the documents back to Dr. Wilson with what appeared to be respect. The next few moments would reveal exactly why the Wilson family belonged in the private terminal, and the revelation would leave Mrs. Peters wishing she had never opened her mouth in the first place. The security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every second of what was about to become one of the most talked about incidents of racial profiling gone wrong. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat, his expression now carrying a hint of what looked suspiciously like amusement. "Dr. Wilson," he began, deliberately emphasizing the title, "would you like me to escort your family to your aircraft? I see here it's the Gulfstream G650 in Bay 7. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. A Gulfstream G650 wasn't just any private jet, it was one of the most prestigious aircraft in private aviation, often referred to as the Rolls-Royce of the skies. Someone in the crowd whistled softly in appreciation. Mrs. Peters' mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Her phone, which had been recording everything, slowly lowered as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "That would be appreciated, officer," Dr. Wilson replied with a subtle smile. "Our pilot has been quite patient, but we do have a weather window to consider." He turned to his family, giving them a reassuring nod. Officer Chen stepped forward. "Mrs. Peters, we need to have a discussion about harassment and inappropriate behavior in the airport." His tone was professional but firm. "Would you please come with me to our office?" But, Mrs. Peters sputtered, her face now cycling through various shades of red. "I was just trying to maintain security. How was I supposed to know they?" She gestured wildly at the Wilson family, unable to complete her sentence. "That's exactly the problem, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez interjected. "You weren't supposed to know anything about them. It wasn't your job to question or challenge their presence here." He paused meaningfully. "In fact, Dr. Wilson and his family have been using this terminal for the past 6 months. They're well known to our staff." A young man in the crowd spoke up. "Hey, aren't you Dr. Wilson from the medical center? You performed my mom's surgery last year." The doctor gave a modest nod, causing another ripple of murmurs through the onlookers. Mrs. Wilson finally stepped forward, her legal training evident in her measured tone. "Officers, we don't wish to press any charges." She glanced at Mrs. Peters, who had shrunk several inches into herself. "We just want to make our flight." Ashley tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we go now? I don't want to miss my tennis practice tomorrow." The normalcy of the child's concern brought a few smiles to the faces in the crowd. "Of course, sweetie," Mrs. Wilson replied, then addressed Officer Rodriguez. "We're ready when you are." Mrs. Peters watched in stunned silence as Officer Rodriguez began leading the Wilson family toward their gate. The crowd parted respectfully, many offering apologetic smiles to the family. Several people were still recording, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected turn of events. Through the terminal's huge windows, the sleek form of the Gulfstream G650 was visible, its polished surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. The ground crew was already preparing for the family's arrival, and their pilot could be seen performing final exterior checks. "Mom," Michael asked as they walked away, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed terminal, "can we take the long route home? I love watching the sunset from above the clouds." The simple innocence of his request, so normal and yet so telling of their actual status, seemed to be the final straw for Mrs. Peters. Officer Chen gently but firmly guided Mrs. Peters in the opposite direction toward the security office. Her designer handbag hung limply at her side, her earlier confidence completely deflated. Several people in the crowd were already tapping away at their phones, no doubt sharing the story on social media. The incident would soon become a viral sensation, but not for the reasons Mrs. Peters had initially intended when she started recording. Instead, it would serve as a powerful reminder about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of not judging others based on appearances. Inside the airport security office, the atmosphere was tense. Mrs. Peters sat in a chair, her designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest as Officer Chen explained the seriousness of her actions. The security cameras had captured everything, and several witnesses had already submitted their phone recordings to the airport authorities. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," the head of airport security, Mr. Thompson, said as he reviewed the incident report. "You took it upon yourself to confront a family, record them without consent, and make accusations based solely on." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Mrs. Peters stared at her expensive shoes, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I thought I was helping," she muttered, but the weakness of her excuse was apparent even to her own ears. Meanwhile, on the tarmac, the Wilson family was being escorted to their aircraft. The ground crew greeted them with familiar smiles. They'd become well known for their kindness and respect toward all airport staff over the past 6 months. "Beautiful day for flying," Dr. Wilson, their pilot, called out, descending the aircraft's stairs to greet them. He'd been with the family since they'd acquired the jet, and his warm professionalism was one of the reasons they'd hired him. As they climbed aboard, Ashley paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at the terminal. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "remember when you told me that success isn't about proving people wrong, but about proving yourself right?" Dr. Wilson smiled at his daughter's insight. "That's right, sweetheart. And what happened today doesn't change who we are or what we've accomplished." Inside the luxurious cabin, Mrs. Wilson was already receiving messages from colleagues who'd seen videos of the incident starting to circulate online. One text was from a fellow attorney. "You handled that with incredible grace. This could be an important teaching moment." Back in the security office, Mr. Thompson was showing Mrs. Peters something on his computer screen. It was a recent article from a business magazine featuring Dr. Wilson's medical practice and their innovative approach to healthcare accessibility. The article mentioned their private jet, not as a luxury, but as a tool that allowed their medical team to reach patients in underserved communities across the Southeast. "The Wilsons use their aircraft for more than just personal travel," Officer Chen explained. "Dr. Wilson flies to rural hospitals twice a month to perform surgeries for patients who couldn't otherwise access specialized care." Mrs. Peters' face crumpled as she realized the full extent of her prejudiced behavior. The family she had so quickly judged wasn't just wealthy, they were making a real difference in people's lives. On social media, the incident was gaining traction. One of the bystanders, a social media influencer, had posted the video with the caption, "Watch karma serve instant justice to airport Karen who harassed the omunendiyars of a private jet. Hashtag prejudit has no flight. Hashtag don't judge ebook Bietskova." As their jet taxied toward the runway, Michael was already in his favorite seat, excited about watching the sunset from above the clouds. Mrs. Wilson used this quiet moment to teach her children a valuable lesson. "You know," she said softly, "that lady's behavior wasn't right, but it's important to remember that responding with anger only creates more negativity. That's why we choose to handle these situations with dignity." Dr. Wilson nodded in agreement. Success is the best response to prejudice. But more importantly, how we treat others, especially when they're not treating us well, that's what truly defines us. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were ready for takeoff. As the powerful engines spooled up, the family settled into their comfortable seats, leaving behind an incident that would soon become a viral example of why appearances can be deceiving. In the terminal, the video continued to spread, But unlike many viral Karen videos, this one was being shared not just for its justice served moment, but for the graceful way the Wilson family handled the situation. It was becoming a powerful testament to maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. By the next morning, the airport incident had exploded across social media platforms. The original video had garnered millions of views, with people sharing their own similar experiences in the comments. But what made this story different was how it was sparking meaningful conversations about prejudice and success. Local news stations had picked up the story, focusing not on the confrontation itself, but on the remarkable work the Wilson family had been doing in the community. A reporter stood outside their medical center, where patients were eager to share their experiences. Dr. Wilson flew out to our small town when no other specialist would come, an elderly patient told the camera, her eyes bright with emotion. He didn't care that we were 3 hours from the nearest city. He said everyone deserves quality healthcare. Inside the airport's administrative offices, officials were reviewing their security protocols. Mr. Thompson, the head of security, had called a staff meeting to address the incident. "This is an opportunity for all of us to learn," he explained to his team. "We need to ensure that every passenger, regardless of their appearance, is treated with respect." Mrs. Peters had become the subject of intense online discussion, though many were surprised by what happened next. Instead of hiding or making excuses, she made the unexpected decision to own up to her mistakes. Through her social media account, she posted a heartfelt apology. "Yesterday, I let my prejudices cloud my judgment and behaved in a way that was hurtful and wrong. Meeting with airport security and learning about Dr. Wilson's work in underserved communities opened my eyes. I'm not proud of my actions, but I'm committed to learning from this experience." Meanwhile, at their Atlanta home, the Wilson family was dealing with the aftermath in their own way. Dr. Wilson had received numerous interview requests, but declined most of them, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Instead, he focused on preparing for an upcoming medical mission to a rural community. Mrs. Wilson, however, saw an opportunity to create positive change. She gathered with other attorneys to discuss ways to address systematic discrimination in public spaces. "What happened to us isn't unique," she explained to her colleagues, "but we're in a position to help make sure it happens less often to others." The children were processing the incident in their own ways. At school, Michael's friends had all seen the video. "Your family's so cool," one friend said during lunch. "My mom says your dad's like a real-life superhero, flying around saving people." Ashley had turned the experience into a powerful speech for her school's social awareness club. "Success isn't about what you own," she told her classmates. "It's about how you use what you have to help others." The incident had also sparked changes at Boston Logan International Airport. The administration announced new training programs focusing on unconscious bias and customer service. They even invited Mrs. Wilson, with her legal expertise, to consult on the program's development. In an unexpected turn of events, several private jet owners reached out to Dr. Wilson, forming a network of medical professionals willing to provide their aircraft for emergency medical transport to underserved areas. The incident had inspired them to think about how they could use their resources to make a difference. Social media continued to buzz with the story, but the trending hashtags had evolved from mocking Airport Karen to promoting messages like #FlyingForChange and #ServiceAboveStatus. People were sharing stories of how success in their communities wasn't about showing off wealth, but about using resources to help others. A week after the incident, Mrs. Peters did something that surprised everyone. She reached out to the airport's community relations department, offering to volunteer for their youth aviation program, which introduced underprivileged kids to career opportunities in aviation. "I want to be part of the solution," she explained simply. 1 month after the airport incident, the story had evolved into something much bigger than a viral video. What started as an uncomfortable confrontation had blossomed into a movement of positive change, touching lives in unexpected ways. The Wilson family's medical outreach program had expanded significantly. Thanks to the network of private jet owners who'd reached out after the incident, their team could now reach twice as many rural communities. Dr. Wilson stood in a small-town hospital in Mississippi preparing for surgery when a nurse approached him with tears in her eyes. "Before you started flying out here," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we had to send critical patients 4 hours away by ambulance. You've changed everything for our community." These were the moments that mattered most to him, not the viral fame or the attention, but the real impact on people's lives. Mrs. Wilson had turned the experience into a force for legal change. She'd helped draft new guidelines for airports nationwide, addressing discrimination and promoting inclusive treatment of all passengers. Sometimes, she told a conference room full of airport administrators, the most painful experiences can lead to the most meaningful improvements. The children had grown from the experience too. Michael's school project about aviation and community service had won first place in the science fair. He presented how private aircraft could be used for medical emergencies, environmental surveys, and disaster relief. "It's not about showing off," he explained to the judges, "it's about reaching people who need help." Ashley had started a student club called Breaking Barriers, where kids shared stories about overcoming prejudice and supporting each other. The club had already spread to 3 other schools in the district. "We want to change how people think," she told her proud parents, one conversation at a time. Mrs. Peters had undergone her own transformation. Her volunteer work with the youth aviation program had opened her eyes to a world beyond her previous assumptions. One Saturday, she found herself teaching a group of excited kids about airport operations, including a young girl who reminded her of Ashley. "My dream is to be a pilot," the girl told her, eyes shining. Mrs. Peters remembered her own prejudices from just a month ago and felt a deep sense of shame and growth. "You can be anything you want to be," she responded, meaning it with all her heart. The airport had become a model for others across the country. Their new training program, developed with input from Mrs. Wilson and civil rights experts, was being adopted by other major transportation hubs. "We're not just changing policies," Mr. Thompson explained to his security team, "we're changing mindsets." Social media had played its part too. The original video was now being used in schools and corporate training sessions as a teaching tool about bias and assumptions. But more importantly, it had sparked a trend of people sharing stories about breaking stereotypes and using success to help others. Local businesses had joined the movement. Several companies had started sponsoring aviation programs for underprivileged youth, inspired by the Wilson story. The private terminal where the incident occurred now hosted monthly tours for school groups, showing kids that aviation careers were within their reach. One evening, as the Wilson family prepared for another medical mission flight, they spotted a familiar face in the terminal. Mrs. Peters was there with her youth group, explaining airport operations. When she saw the Wilsons, there was an awkward moment of recognition. But then she smiled. A genuine, humble smile, and waved. Dr. Wilson waved back, understanding that real change happens one person at a time. As they boarded their jet, Ashley turned to her parents. "You know what's cool?" she said thoughtfully. "That bad day at the airport helped a lot of good things happen." The sunset painted the sky in beautiful colors as their jet took off, carrying medical supplies to another community in need. Below them, the airport continued its daily operations, but with a new awareness and commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. The incident had shown that sometimes the worst moments can bring out the best in people if we choose to learn and grow from them.